Hi, my name is Alex Williams, founder of the New Stack, and you are listening to the New Stack Analyst podcast. Each week, we discuss our latest data research and a topic related to app development and back-end services. My co-host for the show is Donnie Berkholz of 451 Research. Our show this week is brought to you by Pivotal. Pivotal is on a mission to modernize IT. They have a portfolio of applications which include Cloud Foundry, Redis, RabbitMQ, and Spring. They're a steward of open source. You can find them at pivotal.io. Now let's get to the show. Hey, Alex Williams of the New Stack here for the New Stack Analyst Show with my co-host Donnie Berkholz. Hey, Donnie.
How's it going?
Pretty good. And today here with Sarah Novotny and Casey West. Why don't you guys tell a little bit about yourself, Sarah?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I am the head of developer relations for Nginx and am program chair for OSCON. I've been doing open source stuff for many years and focus on the infrastructure and operational side of it.
Great. Casey?
Yeah, hi. So I'm the principal technologist for Cloud Foundry at Pivotal. I've been doing open source for about 15 years. I would say that of those 15 years, this is my 11th OSCON that I'm headed to. So super stoked and happy to be here.
Great. So today, I thought we would do a little preview for OSCON and talk about the main themes that are going to be discussed and some of the themes that you all are interested in hearing about. Casey, why don't we start with you about some of those main themes that you're thinking about when you're going into OSCON next week?
Sure thing. So I think I see a few main themes that I think are all pretty interesting. One of them that's big this year is Internet of Things. I think folks are really interested in not only the embedded systems programming that's happening around Internet of Things and going small, but also going big on all of the infrastructure and in the cloud stuff you need in order to actually connect the world through components. So that's one big theme that I see. Kind of in line with that, there's a lot going on with systems programming and concurrency these days. I see a lot of programming languages really focused on that. Go is, of course, the big one that everybody's mostly excited about, but there's a lot of interesting things happening with Rust and Clojure, and Python's getting into the game as well, so I think that's really interesting. There's also a lot of interest, I saw in the program in particular around, what I would call people hacking. A lot about process and human behavior, psychology, how to communicate well, how to communicate through design. And I think that it's relatively new in the open source community that people are really paying a great deal of attention to that. And that's pretty exciting to me.
Right. So we've gone through growth hacking and now we're into people hacking, which is how you make HR sound cool, right?
Yeah, I think how to make HR sound cool might be the business way of saying that. When it comes to
that's such a concept, I can't even understand it.
Right. I think with community and open source, though, you've got a lot of people in open source projects that have been going on for a very long time. And so I think this is one of these interesting things. How do you grow and maintain a community over time? People come and they go. We have a lot of very inclusive, introspective communities that want to be inclusive and I think need new tools on how to generate interest that is outside of the core group. And so I think there's a lot to do there.
There's also a lot of
interest. Go ahead, Sarah.
I was going to say there's a lot of evolution in terms of the way software is integrated into people's lives so that it no longer can be just command line written for engineers by engineers for the love of nerdery. So you have to think in terms of engineering and design and product almost for whatever you're doing in the world today because you have to differentiate. And that's open source as well as everywhere else.
It seems to be surfacing when you're seeing things like I was at the GopherCon and they were talking a lot about their code of conduct. Mm-hmm. I'm seeing a lot more discussions about this code of conduct. Donnie, what is your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's historically been a huge problem in technology in general, but in open source in particular, of, there's just no diversity. And as a consequence, anything different is regarded as strange and weird and gets treated with some hostility. So I think it's necessary that, we have this framework for telling people, like, here's the standards of behavior here, to make sure it's welcoming for everybody, not just women, although that's hugely important, but like every kind of diversity out there, right? There's, if you look at women at open source conferences, it's probably something like 3% in average. If you look at, how about Black women, good luck finding some of those. It's a huge issue. And, beyond that, with GLBT and everything else, where we've seen, there's research out there saying that every kind of diversity you can add improves the business, how the performance of your business does, and improves the technology you build because you got more viewpoints. And so we have to, go beyond saying like, oh, well, it's okay, you're here, to making it an actively welcoming environment, and get the diversity we need to, build better software.
So Sarah, did one question I was going to ask you was like the types of talks that what the process is for the talks that you have that were being offered for OSCON. Is this a theme that you have been seeing in the talks that came to you guys for review?
It's certainly something that appears as a conversation and appears in sessions. We obviously instituted a code of conduct for OSCON in 2011 and have stood by it over the last many years. We want to focus more on openness, diversity, loving cultures, learning cultures, and a lack of bullying more than any sort of specific bingo of checkboxes for any sort of affirmative anything. So we want to make sure that our conversations are broadly about changing the culture in a way that isn't or isn't making it more opening and more accepting. You find this same sort of behavior happened 20 years ago, 15 years ago between technologies. My Python's better than your Perl was very common. And as the industry has evolved, we've gotten to a much better space where we have views that are more integrated and more accepted. But you still have, to Donnie's point, sort of the other is different and weird. And even if it's not hostile, it is often sort of that zoo and I don't know how to deal with you. And so we're trying to offer that information about how to deal with this new and this other and how to approach it openly and honestly and transparently and learn from it without making anyone who's the least little bit different feel as if they're, part of the petting zoo.
So Sarah, you heard what Casey was saying, some of the themes that he is interested in, and some of the topics he talks about are things we hear a lot about. I'm hearing more about IoT. I'm also hearing more about the increasing the importance of backend as a service with IoT. Go, obviously, Rust enclosure and Python. And then there's discussions about what we're saying with this growth, people hacking kind of stuff. Are those themes that you were seeing come through in the papers that you have, and were there others of note that we will see represented at the show?
Sure. So I slice and dice the schedule slightly differently because I come from an infrastructure background. So what I see is touching on the same things Casey does. I see things like scale. I see things like microservices and distributed systems and the hard math that comes from trying to figure out how to write for distributed systems and then how to manage for distributed systems. So I slice things slightly differently, but it does speak to IoT. It does speak to concurrency. It does speak to a lower level understanding that we want people to get and think about, as opposed to just a language level development. So that was actually one of the big changes we made this year. Is we changed our programming tracks from being language focused to outcome focused. So we have scale, we have solve, we have the people hacking, we have protect for security. And we want to talk about the problems as opposed to the solution of the language or the solution of, we had so many people forgetting that, there might be a really interesting talk about concurrency that happened to be in the Python track, when what we're trying to talk about is concurrency. And with the idea of a polyglot programmer, even if you aren't a Pythonista, you can go and look and understand enough to think about the programmatic paradigm that person's talking about. So we focus more on solutions this year, which I thought was very interesting.
Solutions. Boy, that's an enterprisey word.
Okay, well, we won't use solutions. How about the problem? That's a nerdy word. Let's go dig into the problem, which is scaling, or the problem, which is distributed systems. Or
we can go all the way to business value if you like.
No, don't go there, please.
Do I get to rage quit?
Please don't do that again. No, Donnie, what are the problems? What are the problems, Donnie? Tell us the problems. Give us the answers.
Yeah, that's what they pay me the medium-sized bucks for, right? I guess one other thing that I wanted to add to the sort of trends that that Casey and Sarah have been talking about is, given it is OSCON, there is a pretty significant open source trend across a lot of it, not just in the things being open source, but something that's really started to happen over the last couple of years is end users have started trying to really figure out how to normalize their contributions back to open source software, not just using it, and not just a bug fix here and there, but making major contributions. And we've seen a lot of that starting from the side of major web companies like your Twitters and Facebooks and LinkedIn's, but we're starting to see more of that. And there's, I think 4 or 5 different talks in the schedule on open source software offices, whether it's the to-do group that a lot of the sort of larger social media companies have formed and has been growing from there, or there's actually one on Thursday from Capital One, of all things, saying, here's what we're doing with open source. So that's something that, that's, I think, of the 5 or so talks that I really want to attend, probably 4 of them are on that topic. So
what are those topics that you could, what are those sessions?
There's one on that to-do group that I think is led by Chris DeBona from Google and some other folks. Chris Anajic from Twitter's open source office talking about how they started that up. There's one from Huawei on bringing the open container community into China and helping that collaboration form. There's the Capital one that I mentioned. And then Dawn Foster, who has been in community management for a long time, is giving a talk now that she's gone back to grad school on, I think it's on like network theory applied to communities. So I'm really interested in that.
Yeah. That's interesting. There was actually one on that I saw a session by the people at GitHub.
Yep, that one too.
Yeah, who are quantifying, who are doing some quantification of the open source projects out there.
Yeah, and that's one of those things that like every couple of years somebody tries to do that again, right? So I've done that back at RedMonk. A guy named Aaron Williamson, when I think he was at the was it the SFLC or the SFC or one of those? He was a lawyer there. He did some of that same work, but it's great to see it coming out of GitHub. So they clearly realize the importance of I guess the problem, to go back to that word.
Mm-hmm. We can't actually talk about OSCON without talking about CLS and the Community Leadership Summit and the Community Leadership Metrics Day on Sunday. So this is definitely something that people try and quantify, understand, manage, grow, work with, collect and solicit feedback from, contributions from, and it's a much broader engagement, I think, than most companies who aren't open source do. So I think it's important stuff to always talk about.
Right. There's going to be, I'm sure there's going to be companies. Well, actually, going back to what you're saying, Donnie, about Huawei, I was looking actually at the OCP on GitHub, and they have some big participation actually in the OCP right now. Have you been tracking them at all?
I know. So we as a company, I work for 451 Research. We do track them very closely. I just joined 3 months ago, so I haven't been tracking them particularly closely thus far. But they have been very interested in, getting outside of China and interacting with the rest of the world. which certainly isn't made any easier by the U.S. putting like essentially embargoes on their software, so we can't buy them here. But they are doing their part to get out there, start interacting beyond China, start trying to understand how to connect those communities. More importantly, whether that's OCP or other groups. So I think we'll be hopefully hearing their name a lot more, showing up in the U.S. and really all of us should try and return that favor by going to China and trying to interact with them on their side. Whether it's Huawei or just the rest of the open software community there, because it is a very different ballgame as I understand it.
Casey, maybe that's a good question for you guys about the open source. About your views on open source internationally. How are you guys approaching that? Like, trying to get into China and places like that.
Sure. I know that we have some community events. We participate really heavily, of course, in CF Summit as our participation in Cloud Foundry. And there are some early workings for events in China. So there's a pretty direct connection heading into China. There's a lot of interest, especially at the platform level. Cloud Foundry being a fully open source platform as a service, a fully integrated structured platform. We've seen a lot of interest both at Pivotal in terms of business, and then also Cloud Foundry open source in that level of participation, not just mostly on the user side, but also starting to get into the contribution side as well.
Seems like OSCON needs to get to Asia, or do you guys have an Asia event?
We don't have an Asia event. We are just launching the Amsterdam event this year, so that'll be in the fall. And I'm sure just as both Velocity and Strata have gotten broader, OSCON will as well. But what the specific plans and timelines are, I don't have those answers. This is sadly my last OSCON as program chair. 5 years is enough. So,
wow.
Who's
moving into your role? Do you guys?
Oh, you want the scoop?
Yeah.
I actually don't have a final name, so I can't let you get the scoop this time. I'm sorry, Alex.
Oh well. Had to ask.
Yeah, you got to ask.
So, in terms of international representation, what's it like this year at OSCON?
The actual attendance?
Yeah. Do you have any idea on that?
I actually don't. Last year we had a fairly broad international audience attending. I want to say it was in the tens of percents, but I don't have numbers for this year yet.
So, Sarah, I'm always interested in kind of like the early stuff that you start to see at OSCON. When I first really wrote about Docker, it was at OSCON, and when I first wrote about Assault, it was at OSCON. Mm-hmm. What are you seeing as some of those emerging topics or emerging projects that have been of notice to you guys over at preparing for the conference?
Well, one of the most entertaining statistics I came up with was last year in 2014, we had 0 talks submitted with the buzzword microservices in them. Oh. This year we had 30.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So, to speak to your tongue-in-cheek enterprisey bit, while SOA has been around for a long time, the evolution of SOA and microservices, as a word at the very least, just popped this year for no apparent reason. Containers may be pushing that as well, but that's certainly a possibility. We'll see. One of the big trends we saw this year, and we actually helped with this, was pushing very hard to get a more robust and more articulate track that covers things like security and identity, and making sure, especially after the last year of varying open source exploits available, we wanted to make sure we had more content about that. One of my favorite titles from this year is How My Poodle Lost His Zen State by Seeing a Ghost Going Berserk and Getting Shell-Shocked with a Heart Bleed.
Wow.
Amazing.
It's a brilliant title.
The poodle story.
Yes, the poodle story. So this is from Ryan Ware at Intel, and I just loved that he was able to, in a title, get all of the buzzwords from years security freakouts in it's something that actually almost made sense.
Almost.
And the article, or the talk, actually looks really good as well. So I'm very hopeful that it's a lead off for us within the protect track.
So Casey, what's up with all this microservices buzz that we're hearing about? What, I mean, what and does it? Tell me about what you're going to be thinking about, looking at when you're here in Portland next week. I expect you'll be here for the Kubernetes show and everything else, but what's on your mind on microservices? Is this stuff real? What do you got? How do you guys look at it?
Yeah, sure. So before I jump into that, I come from a security background a little bit, and I feel like I had a buffer overflow with that talk title. So I've had to reboot, but here we are again. Okay, so I think microservices is definitely hot. I do think that containerization is pushing that. The thing that I think is interesting, and I'm going to echo what Sarah said, is that none of these things are particularly new. Service-oriented architecture has been around for a while. Containers are Linux kernel primitives at this point, and widely adopted and accepted and have been for years. But I think that there's a broader movement, especially at scale, and Sarah talked about scale again, which is this idea of really being cloud native, and this concept of cloud native is starting to get a little bit of notice in the industry these days. And when you have to go big, there's sort of a pain that comes with success. And I think that microservices and containerization are an attempt to address those. I think that structured platforms, and I'm here from Pivotal, and I like Cloud Foundry, so I like to talk about structured platforms, but I think that they also lend a hand in easing that pain. And I think that as companies are starting to grow and realize what you really have to do to scale up and scale out, to manage that with the least amount of pain, the least amount of cost, I think that's where all of this is coming from. And so, of course, in open source, we all have our favorite programming languages and orchestration tools and automation tools, and Cloud Foundry is sort of the big umbrella, the giant rainbow that encapsulates, sorry, not Cloud Foundry, rather, OSCON is the giant rainbow that encapsulates all of that.
Little slip there.
Yeah, that was a slip. That was unintentional. But I did mean OSCON, so OSCON historically, and it's right to say that historically it's been very language focused. And now we're in a polyglot era where the language is much less interesting than the problems you're trying to solve. But OSCON has really been a place where, unlike any other, you bring everyone together and you put them in the same place. So, certainly I noticed that I think that on the tutorials track on Monday and Tuesday, there are something like 4 microservices tutorials. And that's a lot of time to spend teaching and explaining microservices, but I think it's worth it. And so I think it is actually just a component of this larger cloud native story. How are we going to be able to horizontally scale with the easing the pain? How are we going to go big? There's also a lot in big data at OSCON, a lot of conversations around data analytics, visualization, and there are certainly tons of talks on those topics in the sessions. So that's all very interesting to me. On the subject of microservices in particular, you can't go wrong seeing a Kelsey Hightower talk, and he has a tutorial on microservices. I think it's on Tuesday afternoon, and if you have an opportunity to visit and go to the tutorials, I'd highly recommend finding a way into that room.
Well, so Donnie, why microservices? Is it the container phenomenon that we're seeing that's really representative here at OSCON?
No, I think it really goes beyond containers. I mean, containers are a way to deliver microservices. They're not the only way. It just so happened that it all came about at the same time, right? I mean, if you go back and read, I guess the initial sort of blog post by Martin Fowler, I don't know, it was a year and a half ago now, maybe, on microservices, it didn't mention containers at all, right? Containers weren't even a popular thing yet. Docker had just been announced for the first time as open source code. And so, it was more of an architectural idea from ThoughtWorks, basically, than it was anything else. So, it just so happened that Docker was here just in time to make the barrier for entry, or the barrier to entry for microservices, a lot lower, so that it was sort of accessible to mere mortals, instead of like the best programmers in the world working at ThoughtWorks, which doesn't scale to the rest of the world, unfortunately. So you've got things like containers, things like Casey's talking about, like paths, all of which contribute to making, I guess, a better approach to software architecture and delivery more accessible to the world. There's still a lot that needs to happen. And hopefully some of the microservices tutorials at OSCON will go into things like how do you debug a microservice? Not trivial, not a lot of tooling there. It's polyglot debugging is what it is, right? Because suddenly you've got debugging well beyond the systems layer you've got to go into databases, you've got to deal with network issues, you've got to be an expert in CAP theorem, all this stuff that makes things a lot more complicated. And I think that's going to be, sort of the next step. And hopefully we're going to start hearing some of that at OSCON.
Full stack developer.
Yeah, I agree with that, by the way. There are a lot of nuances and a lot of difficulties in really fully understanding and deploying a microservices architecture. You need a lot more than to just say we're going to have a dozen REST APIs.
Yeah.
So are we seeing, Sarah, discussions that have corollaries of microservices that you saw trending for the conference?
There are certainly different spaces that fit under and are associated with microservices. So there's lots of, it's REST API, but it's how do you secure REST API through an API gateway or any other way. It's the fact that you have more intersection points and interface points between microservices than you used to have with a monolith. So that ties back to the proper culture of the organization, because if your teams aren't talking well, then you aren't going to have your services interact as well. The quantification of test-driven development and the quantification of communities, like all of these things actually intersect to be what Casey was mentioning about the meeting of the tribes. This is the space where someone else's open source community has a different perspective on the same problem, and you can learn from it. So I think we see microservices as I see microservices as the metaphor for the broader community, and how do we all interact and play well together in a way that's sustainable, scalable, distributed learning, gracious, diverse, all of this. And that's what OSCON is to me, is how do you go in and find this?
So it's kind of like an actualization in person of what Eric Raymond wrote years ago, many eyes make all bugs shallow.
Certainly helps, although as we proved through some of the open source security challenges this year, many eyes still missed many bugs.
Oh, sure. And I mean, the correlate to many eyes make bugs shallow is there actually have to be many eyes looking at the code, and open source doesn't guarantee that, it just enables it.
Yes. It makes it possible. It does not magically get you all the developers doing your thing.
So following this, this line of thinking about microservices as a metaphor, so tell me then how that would apply, for example, to the emergence of the Go programming language.
Okay, so I just came up with that one on the fly, the microservices metaphors for OSCON. So give me a minute to cover how Go fits.
Yeah, some ideas.
I can give it a shot.
Sure.
Sure. So Go, the phenomenon of Go has a lot to do with its performance, in particular, the limited system resources it requires in order to do pretty phenomenal things, and to do it at a speed that we haven't seen in a long time in software. And then you combine that with its simple but powerful concurrency capabilities, and you have a really interesting programming language. A lot of people who are language purists would actually argue that it's kind of an ugly language, but it doesn't have to be beautiful. It's actually quite simplistic, and that leads to a lot of creativity. But to get to microservices, I think that this is again another intersection between a few concepts. We have microservices getting big at the same time that containerization is getting big, and a lot of the value of containerization is in resource isolation and in the management of the computational resources that a given process requires. And so once you have that isolation and you have the portability that is brought on by the concept of isolation, and then you have something that's really powerful and requires very few resources, then you have in Go, then you put those two things together and you can start to really maximize the effectiveness of your infrastructure. So you can start to lower your costs as you scale out. You can go big on concurrency without having to spin up 1,000 virtual machines. Instead, maybe you have 75 virtual machines, but with Go, the CPU requirements are so minimal that you're really taking advantage of 75 machines to do a great deal of concurrency. Those are totally made up numbers, and no one should quote me on that. But I think that that's kind of where the emergence of Go comes in, especially Go with microservices. People really are starting to build APIs and RESTful APIs directly in Go, and I think that there's a lot of opportunity there, especially as our concurrency requirements grow. I think, again, this ties into Internet of Things and the need to connect, millions, potentially billions of devices to the internet. So I think Go's in a good spot.
So where does that leave Rust and Clojure? You were mentioning them as kind of getting into the concurrency world.
Yeah, so Clojure's been around for a while, just like Go, and I think that it has an interesting following. Academics are particularly interested in it. There's no denying the value of marketing, whether we like it or not, in the open source community, and Go has Google pushing it really hard, and it has a really great team telling the world of its virtues, and so that goes a long way. Rust is really new, of course has Mozilla behind it, and I think as a community is just spinning up really. They hit 1.0, about a month back, maybe a month and a half. So I think that Rust will grow and has a great opportunity. I think Clojure, everything has the opportunity to grow, but I think Clojure might have reached some sort of plateau for the time being. Still an interesting language.
Clojure, though, has the JVM behind it, and Nginx is a big, that's a big mover. You're using it already. Why would I go to Go if I can use something I already know and understand in a way?
Totally valid.
Yeah. Right. But one of the things I've heard about, that is that it's kind of just ugly. It's not as elegant as, or as clear as you would with Go. And is that a factor, do you think? Anyone?
So in the business perspective, I'll agree 100% with Sarah. Once you bought into the JVM and you're willing to go all in on that, it's hard to walk away from that. And there are a lot of potential benefits. So if you're getting into systems programming and concurrency and you're trying to reduce your operational overhead, Clojure is a good opportunity.
There's also the Choose Boring technology. There's a talk actually at OSCON called Choose Boring Tech, based on a blog post called Choose Boring Tech. You see a theme here. So this is the idea of, yes, microservices opens up, or even SOA opened up the best tool for the job at the time. Benefit, which is a double-edged sword of, oh God, I now have 4 services written in Go and 2 written in Clojure and something else written in Rust. And there was a guy who wanted to do something in Elixir for some reason, or on Elixir. Then, you get to this point where you have this hairball of chaos of too many things. So, you have a double-edged sword, and Go is shiny and new, and I think a lot of people want to standardize on it, but there's also the balance of making sure that you choose tech that fits your organization. When I ran dev teams, I made sure that everyone, anytime we made a choice for technology, at least 2 people understood it. That was the baseline rule. You could pick the best one for the job as long as 2 of you knew it.
Sarah, was there anything on Swift at this year's, did you guys come across any kind of talks on Swift at all?
We actually have a training on Swift.
Okay.
Yes, and so we have at least a training on Swift. I'm not positive if we have any other talks on it, but we thought that it was something that might be really interesting and really useful. And then we looked prescient because Apple went and open sourced it.
Donnie, have you been following the Swift story?
Yeah, I've been following it. Obviously the open sourcing is going to be a big deal. I was just attempting to search the OSCON schedule. Apparently that's not a thing.
I'm looking at our training. I'm looking at our training. Programming with Swift, solid fundamentals, advanced language features, and open source libraries.
I just dropped the link into our chat in case you're all wanting to see it.
Okay. How is Swift evolving, Donnie? Have you seen? I mean, it goes back to kind of what you were talking earlier about, how open source organizations are managed and stuff. It seems like the Swift, the Swift story is really kind of a good case to look at in terms of how they're approaching it as as being something that will be open sourced.
Yeah, how is Swift managed right now? It's managed by Apple, right?
Right.
Whether it's open source or not, they own the name. Just like Mozilla does with Firefox, right? Nobody else can go out there and change Swift and call it Swift. They have to call it something else.
Just like Docker.
Which is, the power of trademarks. They still, apply to open source. And, Canonical's gone through some of this in the past couple of days too, with trying to understand IP policies and how to control things while still enabling some level of freedom and some level of experimentation, which is a challenge. So we'll see how that goes with Swift. I'm very curious whether they're going to enable much involvement at sort of the design level for future versions of Swift. That's going to be the biggest question. I'm not sure, but I would assume that they're going to be willing to take fixes to Swift, much like they are with WebKit, for example. But we'll see how it goes, because as you know, and probably everybody listening knows, Apple's not historically like an open source contributor company. They use open source happily. They pull in lots of it. They'll release it when they have to, right? Like the Darwin kernel behind OS X. But in terms of being an active contributor to open source, that's not something that's been a cultural aspect of how they work, right? How they work is build something incredible in secret and then reveal it to the world. And so I'm not sure how that's going to work with Swift, because it's, how do you do that in an open source world without alienating the very people you're doing it for? I think it's going to be a more difficult challenge now that it's open source, but at the same time, being open source does drastically, increase the reach of Swift, right? It can be used in different places that aren't on an iPhone now. At least it will be able to. And so, that's going to be a big deal. And all of those people using it are going to want some kind of say, just because they heard it's open source. So we deserve to have a say, right? In a way that they wouldn't feel, with proprietary languages, right? There's no feeling like, oh, well, I should have totally been able to do whatever I want with, C# before Microsoft started open sourcing anything. But now things are changed, right? The expectations are different because it's open source. So I'm not sure how that's going to play out, but it's definitely going to be a challenge for Apple to walk that balance beam.
Do you think that's more true of languages than tools? Because we have open source tools that are run by open source companies that are very company-led. We have open source projects that are very community-led and very consensus-based. Do you think that's more the case, or that Apple runs a finer line to wend because it's a language?
It's a good question. It depends on how important, I guess, new versions of the language are going to be to Apple, right? Because, like you said, it is a language. It's a lot lower level than most of the stuff they reveal upon the world with, sparkles and magic and all that. I think it's still going to be a really large challenge. And like the other examples you kind of alluded to, I think people, at least people in the development world, have a pretty good understanding of like, well, is that really open source in the open community sense, or is it just technically open source in the sort of throw it over the fence kind of sense, right? Like, I don't know, Android might be an example of a project that's gone that way, where a lot of development happens, either inside Google or in secret or whatever with its partners. The open source individual community doesn't have a lot of chance to participate. So there are, two different approaches to open source actually three different approaches really, right? You've got we develop it internally, call it open source. We really don't care what you do with it, which is probably the worst approach in my opinion. And then there's the sort of consortium model, and then there's the individual model, right, which would be like the Apache model. The consortium one might be more like Cloud Foundry.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, I think there are different levels of participation in the open source community broadly, especially when companies are participating. And I actually think this is something that's going to be interesting to play out over the next few years as more companies are saying, we are an open source company almost as a business model. But I think there are also concentric circles of participation. You've got a core team, and maybe that core team is largely comprised of members of the company, or in Cloud Foundry's case, there's a foundation, which is a lot like the Open Container project, where you have a handful of companies that all have a vested, certainly financial interest in the success of that project. So they form a foundation together and work together. That's the way Cloud Foundry works. That's the way that the Open Container stuff seems to be going. But I do think there is an interesting conversation to be had about how corporations participate in open source and what it really means to be open source.
I think probably for me, one of the things that strikes me most about how the open source world has changed over the past year is the commercial orientation, which was leading into, which we've been seeing kind of happen over the past several years, but now it seems to be really, really accelerating, where the commercial orientation is becoming such a primary driver for open source. Donnie, would you agree with that or no? Or has that always been the case?
Sorry, could you kind of rephrase that? I'm not quite sure I followed what you were trying to get at.
Well, I mean, you see a lot of these like open source consortiums like Cloud Foundry, OpenStack, right? Now we have, Docker's starting to go down some path. We don't know what exactly it's going to be with OCP. We see, these organizations being built really around corporations, right? And the open source projects themselves often are associated, you can see with an entrepreneur, for example, right? If you look at the container ecosystem and all the projects there, that are open source, a lot of them are associated with companies, and that seems to me, a different way, a different kind of thinking about open source, and maybe just due to its maturity over the past several years more than anything else.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with you in general, right? Companies have been around in open source for a long time. I mean, if you can go back to probably the early 2000s, look at Linux kernel contributor stats, and you'll see that there are a lot of companies involved, right? I mean, like today, it's about 15% volunteer involvement in the Linux kernel. That was exactly the same case back in like 2007, 2008. And it's just because that became popular earlier on, right? And as any software becomes more popular, regardless of what it is, you're going to see more companies getting involved in it because they'll see a profit motive for themselves to, get involved in that ecosystem to make some money off of it. I mean, we're seeing that right now with microservices, right? Sarah gave the example of, last year there were 0 talks proposed. This year there are 30. How many of those people do you think are employed by a company that has a marketing interest or a sales interest in giving that talk? Probably quite a few of them. There will be some that aren't, don't get me wrong, but a lot of them are going to be employed to do so. And it's the same thing with open source. I mean, you could argue that, that very fact means that open source has won, right? Or at least is a long way toward winning, right? Because we've got so many people working on open source code who are able to be gainfully employed to do so, where that, like I said, 10 years ago wasn't the case unless you very carefully picked your project to work on. Now there are a lot more areas of opportunity for people to be gainfully employed working on open source software because it's gotten such adoption. So yeah, in general, I agree with you that open source is becoming more corporate, at least for projects that are important to corporate business infrastructure. There's always going to be fun projects out there doing whatever, like playing games on a web app or something. Or I worked on a Linux distro that is generally used by hobbyists, and that's totally fine. But there are a lot more opportunities for people to get involved, doing open source at the corporate level, and I think that's it's got some downsides, no question about it, because the motivations of companies are very different than the motivations of individuals to work on open source. And so you have to make sure that your governance structures and your community structures can cope with corporate motivations spread across large numbers of developers, all of whom are getting involved. And they can cope with that, potential imbalance. But all in all, I think, it's very good for the open source community that this is happening. And it's just something that they have to learn how to deal with.
Yeah, I'm curious from your perspective, Casey, because I mean, for me, it's not something good or bad. I'm just trying to understand it, and and find ways to explain it. You guys must talk about this stuff, and it's a pivotal lot.
We do. There are a few key drivers that probably have less to do with profit motive than anything else. Having a commitment to open source, and there are a lot of projects that come out of Pivotal, provides a few things for us. Certainly, it's a recruiting tool. We want to hire people who like open source and want to invest themselves in it. They get to contribute to pretty large scale, prominent projects, and their name gets out there. That's good for them. So it's certainly a driver in terms of getting people in the door, and that's a really big deal. But I think there might be a bigger one that I see as a overall benefit, not just for open source, but for companies and their customers. In particular, by open sourcing things like Cloud Foundry and keeping it fully open source, putting a governance structure in place with a foundation that's comprised of many members, there's a commitment, an explicit and public commitment to innovation over the long term for us that our customers get to benefit from. Not only are we committing to doing our work in the open, and we primarily do that almost entirely, but if those projects stagnate, then our customers notice and our potential customers notice, and that's not good for us. And so that's sort of a bidirectional commitment there. Mm-hmm. I see that as a really big value.
Well, great. Well, we're coming up to, we've been talking for about 45 minutes or so. I thought maybe just conclude it with everyone kind of thinking, whenever a conference comes up, there's always some meme that kind of pops up, some surprising thing that comes out of the conference that you weren't expecting going in. Any theories of your guys of what might be become something interesting or surprising that comes out of OSCON, Sarah?
I am surprised every year by what the new tech is, and so I almost don't want to say, because there is in past years there has been so much focus on the different languages, as we talked about emerging languages a little bit earlier. Those have been in the past the things that have popped, like, oh, we've all started talking about Clojure, or we've all started talking about JVM languages, or Go last year and the year before. So it's been very language focused. I'm hoping that this year it's not specifically language, but it's more design pattern focused, and away from, as much as I love microservices and I think that's interesting, I think there are harder problems than the design pattern and the evolution, and to your point, Alex, some of the marketing that has happened around microservices. I think there are also very interesting challenges in the operational side that have not yet been addressed, and I'm hopeful that some of those, like with the Kubernetes launch, or not launch, but Kubernetes event and such, will be things that we talk about around containers and microservices this year.
Casey?
I would say that I'm somewhere in between. The biggest surprise I ever saw at OSCON, I believe it was 2007, Simon Wardley gave a keynote, or the closing keynote, where he's kind of launched the entire concept of a platform as a service, and then he went on to work on things like Zimkey, and that was kind of a pivotal moment, I think, in our industry. I'm definitely in line on microservices and the lowering of the cost of success that I mentioned earlier. I think there's a lot more to do there. Kubernetes is definitely interesting. The way that we're elevating the conversation from microservices and containers to something bigger and something more orchestrated is interesting, and I am hopeful that I will be surprised to learn of very new and interesting projects that take us from a place where we need to be concerned about twiddling the bits in a very large-scale infrastructure to more automation and maybe more of the robots doing the work for us.
Donnie?
Yeah, I think the thing that, something I've been passionate about for a long time is the importance of culture in open source communities and companies. I've been giving talks about it since probably 2008, or if not earlier. And so the thing that I don't think I will be surprised by, but I would love to be surprised by, is that the dominant conversation in the hallways at OSCON is all about culture, versus being about microservices or about Go or about anything else. I mean, one of the things that we didn't talk about at all is, I think on Tuesday, alongside everything else that's happening, there's a tech leadership conference called Cultivate that's happening within OSCON. And hopefully they're sticking around for the rest of the conference, interacting with everybody else. And especially with the change to, I guess, problem-focused tracks rather than language-focused tracks, hopefully that'll build some of that empathy across all these spaces. And we can talk about not just what are we building, but how are we building it, from the level of working together.
Well, that's one, I think, that seems like a significant one, the whole culture one. And Sarah, I think you would certainly agree with that.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, one of the pieces that I'm happy to have left as a legacy for OSCON is adding the geek lifestyle, which functionally is the culture, and how do you empathize with your shared workers, your shared community, and how do you make that a better, more functional place? How do you leave it better? How do you leave it better when you leave?
Well, Sarah, congratulations on a great 5-year run. I know OSCON is going to Austin next year. We'll miss it here in Portland. But I expect this time next year, you might be doing something different. So good for you. You might maybe even a vacation or something. But I want to go.
I'm unfamiliar with this word. How do you spell it?
I think it's one we're all quite unfamiliar with. Donnie, because Donnie, I saw somewhere on Twitter you're going to Aruba.
Oh yeah, I take my vacation. I make sure that it's not work hard, party hard. I do try and maintain a very reasonable work-life balance, though. I think that's talking about culture. That's one of the big problems we have in technology is how to turn off.
That was exactly that is a very good point.
My wife and I are in business together, and it's one of our biggest challenges all the time, trying to figure out how to how to turn it off, how to have to turn off the discussion on these things. So, in any case, thank you guys for joining me today. This is Alex Williams of the new Stack Analysts. We'll see you guys at OSCON next week.
Sounds good.
Thanks.
Take care.
Great. Thanks all. That's it for this week's show. Thank you very much for joining us. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Pivotal. Pivotal is on a mission to modernize IT. They have a portfolio of applications which include Cloud Foundry, Redis, RabbitMQ, and Spring. They're a steward of open source. You can find them at pivotal.io. Audio editing and sound design for the new Stack Analyst podcast is provided by Broken Hours. You can find them at brokenhours.com. Thanks again, and hope to see you back at the show. Bye-bye.